Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I I figured the best place to start the description of this trip is with some of the backstory. And I do have a couple hours to do this, but you'll have to realize that this trip took me almost 3.5 months to complete. And therefore, if it feels like we're rushing through this, it's because we are. It takes a good amount of time to tell the entire story. Um, on the screen now, you'll see the URL that you can go to for the blog that I wrote during this trip, and a lot of the detail, a lot more information is available if you are to go to frogp48.blogspot.com. You can get a lot of the detail that I'm just going to have to skip over today simply because of time. So to start with the backstory, I was very happily married for 39 years to a wonderful woman who passed away suddenly from a heart attack. And as a result of that, I was working my way through the grief process. And I was talking to my daughter one day. She said, "You know what you're going to have to do? You're going to have to buy a motorcycle." And I had ridden motorcycles. Actually, I had raced motorcycles when I was young, but hadn't had a motorcycle in 40 years. But I took her word for it. I went out and bought a motorcycle, went to show it to a friend of mine, and he made the comment that, "Well, now that you've got a motorcycle, you can ride around the country." And I took that quite literally. So my P48 trip, the P48 is the perimeter of the lower 48 states. The first thing I did to the motorcycle was I had some artwork done to take my dear wife with me on this trip. And I had artwork done on both fenders, got the vanity plate on the back, and I was ready to go. The next thing was to set up the objectives for the trip. And I'm the type of person that doesn't do a whole lot of planning. So this was kind of a new thing for me. But the objectives were to stay as close as possible to the actual perimeter of the lower 48 states, but stay on paved roads. I didn't want to do any dirt roads with my new shiny motorcycle. And I also wanted to stay off the interstate highways. I enjoy going through the small towns and staying away from restaurant chains, that type of thing. I had planned originally to camp along the way, and as it ended up, I was on the road for 94 days and I only camped once. So I kind of went back on my word on that one. But one of the main things was to take my time and enjoy the trip and not rush to get there. And I did my best. It didn't always meet up to that standard either. There was 3 things on the list that I felt I had to do while traveling around the country. And these were bucket list items that I had not, to this point, had not accomplished. One, I'm a big fan of transportation of all types, but specifically aviation. So I wanted to go to Big Kill Devil Hill over in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, see where the Wright brothers flew their plane. I had been to New York City any number of times during my life, but for one reason or another, I had never actually seen the Statue of Liberty. So that was very high on my list. And then for personal reasons, and I hope I have time to explain this when we get around to that part of the country, I definitely wanted to go to Glacier National Park. That was a promise that I had made to my wife before she passed away. So I spent the winter prior to this trip with AAA tour books, going through trying to find everything that sounded interesting along the perimeter route. And I ended up with about 150 points of interest. Now, I never did intend to go to all of these and take part in them. However, I felt when I got to an area, if time allowed, if the weather allowed, if my finances allowed, that these were things that I could do if I was in the mood to do them. So I kind of laid those out ahead of time. So from there, the next thing was to start my trip. Timing wise, weather was the big consideration. I wanted to leave early enough in the year that I didn't end up killing myself in the heat of the desert going across the southern states, but it had to be late enough in the year that I could get across the pass over in Oregon to the coast to begin the trip without any snow and ice on the road. So I ended up, the trip started on April 26th of 2016. And I did make it up and over the pass. I spent the night in Sisters, Oregon, just before this pass. And when I woke up that morning, the weather report said it was 32 degrees on top of the pass. So by the time I got there, it was just barely not frozen. And going down the other side of the pass, there was a lot of fog, but I didn't have any slippery roads. So that was a blessing in itself. Made it over to the coast in Newport, Oregon, and came to Highway 101. I took a left, and from there, it was just a matter of following my front tire. We went across the Newport Bridge and continued down the coast, headed south. One of my first stops on day 2 was a place called the Sea Lion Caves. And you take an elevator down from the top of the cliff, several stories down to Oceanside, and there's a cliff that this cliff actually fills with water as the tide comes in, and the seals come in here to rest and warm up a little bit. I think it didn't smell real good, and it was quite noisy, but it was an enjoyable thing to take in anyway. For me, the thing that I enjoyed most was looking out in the other direction and looking at the coastline, looking back up the coast. I believe this is the Hasetta Head Lighthouse that's out on that point in the center of the picture there. But with the waves crashing against the shore, it was just a real beautiful setting. I really enjoyed it. Highway 101, as you travel down through Oregon towards California, has any number of places where it comes right out to the ocean. So there was no lack of photo opportunities. I took a lot of pictures on this trip. When I got done with the trip, I counted, and I had taken over 2,800 pictures. So thank God for digital photography. Would have gone broke trying to develop all that film in the old manner. So as I was approaching the southern end of the Oregon coast, I came into the town of Port Orford. Now, I had never been to Port Orford before, but I found this bay very picturesque. It was something that I hadn't seen before, and I was glad that I stopped there. As I was coming down the hill, there was a sign painted on the road said "Ocean View" straight ahead. So I went and not only had a good view of the bay, but if you look across the bay, you see Humbug Peak, which is the tallest point on the Oregon coast at just over 1,700 feet elevation, I believe. And so I took some pictures there, continued on down the coast, crossing into California. And I believe this is Crescent City, the Battery Point Lighthouse, if I remember right. And it's the oldest lighthouse, I believe, in California. And it's on the list of historical sites. So I'm trying to cruise along here as quickly as possible. Next stop was in Klamath, California, at the Trees of Mystery. And I had actually been there before, but I stopped and took this picture because I was staying in the motel for the night across the street. I didn't actually go to the Trees of Mystery on this trip, but if you have never been there, that is something to behold. The redwoods are just fascinating. And if you've never seen the redwoods before, this will give you an idea scale-wise just how big some of these trees are. They're mammoth, and definitely something that you want to do. On a previous trip there, I had gone through the Redwood National Forest. In this particular case, I went to the Redwood State Park for California. Saw a little bit different terrain, but still a lot of very large, very beautiful trees. When I got down to, I believe it's Leggett, California, Highway 101 kind of made a beeline towards the Bay Area, and I cut off to the coast again on Highway 1, went up and over a beautiful mountain road. And one thing I enjoy doing on a motorcycle is what I call mountain dancing. You get into a rhythm where you're going left, right, accelerating, decelerating. And a lot of people don't like mountain roads. I love them. And this one was just beautiful because the trees were right at the edge of the road. They had grown way up in the air and actually over the top of the road in many places. In broad daylight, I had to turn my headlight on to drive this road because it was dark enough that I didn't know for sure people could see me. So anyway, it was a beautiful road, went over to Fort Bragg, California. And from there, the next day, came back up and over the mountains again, back to Highway 101 and into San Francisco. Now in San Francisco, I was going to spend a couple days with my brother sightseeing. So I entered the city from the north over the Golden Gate Bridge. And I wanted to put this picture on there. Everybody's seen pictures of the Golden Gate Bridge, but the thing I found fascinating about this is to move more traffic across the bridge, they've installed something called the zipper. And it fascinated me. They have these flexible barriers down the middle of the road. And in the morning, because most of the people coming into the city, they have these set up so they have an extra lane of traffic coming into the city. After rush hour is over, the zipper goes down and moves these barriers to the other side of the lane and puts the extra lane for the afternoon to get traffic out of the city. And I thought that was really very ingenious of somebody. So spending a couple days in San Francisco, one of the things I told my brother I really wanted to do was to go to Alcatraz. So we got on the ferry and headed out to the Rock. And of course, it's iconic site in the bay in San Francisco. So that was one of the things we did. And then when we got back to dry land, we went on several types of ground transportation. This particular streetcar was one that the city of San Francisco had purchased from other cities around the world, refurbished and put into service. So I don't know if you can make it out or not, but there's a sign in the window on each of the cars telling where it came from. This one happened to be from Dallas. We also went on one from Milan, Italy. So they literally have collected these cars from all around the world. These are electric cars. You can see the wand on top of the car that follows the electric cable overhead. We also went on the BART rapid transit system as primarily a subway system, although it does periodically surface to tie together with the bus. And then, of course, we had to go on the iconic cable cars through San Francisco. These cars are very unique. I don't know, there probably are other cities that have them, but I don't know of any. But there's a cable underneath the road, and each car has a device that fits down through the slot in the road and grabs a hold of the cable. The cable pulls the car along at a constant 9.5 miles an hour through the city. And there's 2 loops of these cables underneath the streets of San Francisco. Most of the people that you see on these cars, however, are tourists. The locals usually don't like to take the streetcars or the cable cars because there's sometimes a 2 to 2.5 hour waiting time. That's not very good if you're trying to get to work. Continuing south out of the Bay Area, I rode down through the beautiful stretch along Monterey Bay, down through Carmel, and got some really nice pictures. There is a very scenic drive down through the Carmel area. It's called 17 Mile Drive, and they won't let motorcycles on that drive. So I did not get any pictures along that drive, but looking down to the ocean, it was quite picturesque and really kind of takes your breath away, actually. A little bit further south, I got down to the Big Sur area, and I had heard about this area all my life. I was really pleased with the scenery that I saw here. And if you want to see this area, you might want to go pretty quick because this highway, well, actually right now the highway is closed because of a landslide. They're scheduled to reopen it later this month, but it's becoming more and more common that this road gets taken out by landslides in the area. So you might want to take this, and I would recommend too, if you do take this drive, do it from north to south. If you're on the northbound lanes, you really don't see as much of the coast as you do when you're going south. The view is much better headed south. So I'll give you that little tip. I did spend the night in Big Sur. I had a little hotel room, and this hotel room had a bed, a shower, and a writing table, and that was about it. You had to go outside to change your mind. It was that small. But this ended up being the most expensive motel room I had on my entire trip. And to top things off, the next morning I stopped and got gas in Big Sur and paid $6.95 a gallon. This is back in 2016. So things are expensive in Big Sur, California. Continuing down the coast, the early morning driving along the California coast is really unique because the mist always gathers along the shoreline and then rises up over the mountains as the day begins to warm, and you get some very dramatic pictures. And I really enjoyed it. In this particular spot, I was at Julia Pfeiffer Burns State Park, I believe it's called. And there's a walkway that goes underneath the highway, and then you walk along the ocean for, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of a mile or something like that. And you have beautiful views. This little lagoon just took my breath away. And I've actually seen a picture just like this that Microsoft uses on some of their screensavers on the computers. But this was probably one of the prettiest sights that I saw on the entire trip. And if you went just a little bit further down the trail, you can look back up along the coastline to the north. And unfortunately, a lot of this landscaping is falling into the ocean also, but it sure makes for a nice picture now. Continued down to San Simeon, and I took a tour of the Hearst Castle. This castle is unbelievable. It sits on 250,000 acres of land near San Simeon. It's 165 rooms, I believe 20 or 25 bedrooms, something like that. It took about 28 years to build to a point where they considered it substantially complete, but it never was completed during William Randolph Hearst's lifetime, because every time he traveled somewhere, he'd buy a piece of art or a statue or some antiquities, something, and he'd come back and tell the architect, design another room. I want to put this out on display. And so his architect worked for him full time for 28 years until his death. And now they give tours. It's so large, they had 3 different tours that you can take there because you can't see it all in one tour. The tour I took in the dining areas and the inside pool, which was quite lavish. So continuing down the coast from there, this day just kind of fell in place for me automatically. I had noted that I would like to stop in Oceano, California, and go to a melodrama play that's presented by a art group in Oceano. And I had forgotten all about it, but I happened to stop here for strawberries. And while I was standing next to my bike eating a strawberry, I looked across the road, and it was the box office for the theater that I had intended to go to this play. So I went over and bought a ticket, but the play didn't start until that afternoon. So I asked them, well, where can I get something to eat? It was about lunchtime. And I asked them for a small local restaurant that had some local color. And they said, oh, you have to go to the Rock and Roll Diner. And this was quite the interesting diner. So I pulled in and parked. The first thing I did was look at the sign on the front of the Rock and Roll Diner. It was a Saturday, and Saturday was Betty Boop night. And my late wife's name was Betty. And I thought that was kind of cool. I'm going to have to go in here and eat. So I go inside, and who meets me at the door but Betty Boop. So I had to take a picture of Betty while I was there. So I'm sitting in the booth eating my lunch, and I hear guys at the next table, and they're a bunch of veterans, and they're talking about the things that they do. And they were talking about flying airplanes. When they got up to leave, I noticed the one guy had a logo on his shirt that said he was a pilot of a World War II airplane. So I asked him about it. He said, yeah, he gives sightseeing tours. And he invited me over to the airport, which happened to be right behind the diner. So I went over and took a flight in a 1943 Stearman airplane, an old World War II biplane. Now, that wasn't on my bucket list, but I didn't know that you could get a ride in such a plane where it would have been on my bucket list. So went up in this plane, taxied down the runway, just had a great time. I really enjoyed this flight, probably as much as anything I did on the entire trip. And it's something I've talked about endlessly since getting back. Got up, flew a couple loops around the bay at Oceana, came back and landed again, and hopped on the bike and headed south. And this is, I believe, just north of Malibu, California. Wasn't a lot in the way of sandy beaches, but these rocks were piled up alongside the highway, and it made for quite a picturesque setting along Malibu. I continued south, went a little ways inland, and went to Legoland. I met my son, who lives in Temecula, California. My son had taken his family to Legoland for a birthday party for his daughter. And so we spent the day at Legoland. Now I've been to Disney World, Disneyland, and now I've been to Legoland. And I was kind of disappointed myself. It wasn't up to the Disney standards. But Legoland is a lot of entertainment for the kids, and I guess that was important. When I left Temecula, instead of following the exact perimeter and going through all the residential neighborhoods of San Diego down along the Mexican border, I cut up and over the mountains, kind of cut the bottom of California off there so that I could be on the open road. And about 17 miles outside of Temecula on Highway 79, I went past this standing on the side of the road. So I had to circle around and come back. This was the kind of thing I was hoping that I would stumble across on this trip. This is the artist workshop for, I believe his name is Ricardo Bracetta. And he's a well-known artist in California. You've probably seen some of his works in various pictures taken around California, but he has probably 1.5 acres of land there that has all of these full-size metal sculptures that his artists have made over the years. And they're sitting out on display for everybody that comes by and can stop and enjoy them. And they're just incredible. I couldn't figure out how to tie this on the back of my motorcycle, so I didn't buy anything while I was there. Continuing along, went through Yuma and started out across the desert of Arizona, got to Gila Bend, and stopped for lunch at the Space Age restaurant. And this was just such a unique looking building. I had to stop there. And I asked the waitress if there was a reason it was shaped like a spaceship, and everything inside was also outer space oriented. She said, yeah, the guy that built this actually worked for NASA and was involved in most of the early space projects that NASA put on. And when he retired, he moved to Gila Bend. He wanted to open a restaurant, so he decided on the design for the building. So I thought that was kind of unique. When I left Gila Bend, I headed south to Tombstone, and there's no better way to see Tombstone than a tour and a stagecoach. So, and you probably have noticed by now that modes of transportation kind of became an underlying theme for my trip. And I started keeping track of how many modes of transportation I could take advantage of along the way, and began to look for ways to get in more of them. But had a great tour, went to the gunfight at the OK Corral reenactment, and learned some of the history of Tombstone. And then I headed south towards the Mexican border, and I stumbled across one of the greatest little towns that nobody has ever heard of, Bisbee, Arizona. Bisbee used to be a mining town. They had a large copper mine there and very prosperous. It was a large town for many, many years, dating back to the 1800s. And in the 1960s, they closed the copper mine. And the copper mine was kind of the source of employment for most of the people in town. So a lot of the people left. It got so bad that they offered the entire town for sale to locals, and nobody took them up on it. So an artisan couple from out of town came and bought the town and turned the historic district into an art colony. And there are a lot of boutiques and things like that in town, but the people that live there just live a different lifestyle, as you can probably tell from the way this person has their everyday vehicle decorated. They get together every evening. They have a little parade, go up to Castle Rock at the top of the hill and say goodbye to the sun as it's setting. And I was in a restaurant when the sun went down and they turned the streetlights on, and even their streetlights are a little bit unusual. So it was just a really unique town. I can't wait to go back again. The hotel I stayed in was the Inn at Castle Rock, and it's designed to look like a steamboat. The hotel has no internal hallways. All of the rooms are accessed off of the balconies. And I did have a very unusual night that night in my room, and I wrote about it in my blog. It's a very personal entry, but if you go to my blog, you can check that out. But the next morning I walked through the lobby and I see there's a logbook in the lobby for guests to write down any paranormal experiences that they have there. And I didn't write my experience in there, but several people have written things down. It turns out the place is haunted, if you believe in such things, but that's the word on the street, is that this is a haunted hotel. Continued a little ways south of Bisbee and came to Douglas, Arizona, and literally came to the Mexican border. At that point, I turned around and headed up a little bit further north through Arizona, crossed into New Mexico. When I did that, I simultaneously crossed back into the Mountain Time Zone, and shortly thereafter crossed the Continental Divide. This is, I believe, the lowest point of the Continental Divide as it goes all the way up through the continent at just 4,520 feet elevation. It's the lowest point where a road crosses the Continental Divide. Ironically, I ended up crossing the second lowest point on the Continental Divide on the return trip when I was up north. Went all the way down to Brownsville, Texas. Once I got there, and Texas is such a big state, it took me almost a week to ride the perimeter of the state of Texas. I was averaging about 250 miles a day, which obviously in a car you could do more than that, but I found that was about right for me. Comfortably travel 250 miles on a motorcycle and then still have time to do some sightseeing along the way. So it worked out well for me. Along the Gulf Coast, however, you notice right away that all the houses are up on stilts. And this, of course, is because of hurricane season. And this was on the 1st of June, and it was the first day of hurricane season. So the hardware store was on the radio advertising that they were having their hurricane sale and come on in and buy your plywood. So I don't know how these people do it, but they do it and they love the area. So the stilts, of course, are to get the house up high enough that the water, when it comes in from the hurricane storm surge, goes under the house instead of through it. Went over to Houston, then took a side trip from there to see my daughter in the Dallas area. and we spent a couple days sightseeing there. Found another mode of transportation over in Fort Worth. Got to climb on this big boy, and didn't go too far. I think we went about 6 inches, but I counted it as a mode of transportation. But of course, any baby boomer, when you're in the Dallas area, if you haven't done it before, one of the things that you really kind of have to take in is the Daily Plaza site of the 1963 assassination of JFK. This picture was taken standing on the street that they've marked out where the motorcade was. And at the time that the fatal bullet struck the president from, at least they say, from the upper window on the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. And that entire 6th floor has now been turned into a national museum dealing with the Kennedy assassination. And here's the picture looking in the other direction. You see there's somebody standing on the X in the street down there. So that was quite an emotional thing for me, because I was, a young man when that event took place. And that's one of those events for most baby boomers where you'll always remember where you were when you heard the news that the assassination had taken place. Going back to Houston, now I want to mention very briefly, I had traveled the Oregon coast, California, all the way across the desert, 5,000 miles into this trip. And this was the first day that I got rained on. And that was just absolutely marvelous. I was telling people along the way that my job was to operate the motorcycle. My wife's job was to push the clouds aside, and she just did a great job. So I have to give her credit for that. Got to Houston. One of the things on my list was to go to the Johnson Space Center. They had just opened up a new exhibit. This is an actual Boeing 747 shuttle transport plane, but it's a mock-up of a space shuttle, a full-size mock-up. It's not an actual shuttle. When you go inside, they make the command center, I guess you could call it, in the cockpit of the shuttle look as if you're actually in operation, but these were all just fake displays. But it was still, if you're interested in anything having to do with outer space and the space program, it was definitely something that you need to do when you're in that area. Continued over to the far eastern point of Texas, went to Port Arthur, Texas. Now, one of Port Arthur's most famous residents was Janis Joplin. They have a Port Arthur museum there, and there's an entire wing devoted to Janis Joplin. One of the things my wife and I never could agree on was Janis Joplin. I love her music. She could not stand it. So I usually listen to her music whenever my wife wasn't around. But I had to stop and take this in. It turns out that Port Arthur is part of what they call the Golden Triangle, which is Beaumont to Port Arthur to, I believe, Orange, Texas. And that little point on the eastern end of Texas has been the hometown or the home area for any number of famous people throughout the history of the United States. And this museum told you a lot about many of these people. So I had a good time touring that museum. I also took the time to go up to Beaumont because I heard they had a museum up there to honor another one of the people from the Golden Triangle, Babe Zaharias. And there is not enough time in a day to go into detail about everything that she accomplished during her life. ESPN voted her the greatest female athlete of the 20th century and one of the 10 best athletes of either gender of the 20th century. And she was just absolutely incredible at everything she ever attempted. Most people know her as a golfer. She competed in a dozen other types of athletic events, won gold medals in the Olympics, and she was the first woman ever to qualify for a PGA men's golf tournament and make it through the cuts and play all 4 days. So do some research on her. She's just an incredible woman. Continuing along the coast, went to the French Quarter in New Orleans. And unfortunately, I love jazz. I always looked forward to making it to New Orleans. When I got there, I got off the bus. I realized apparently I've lived in Idaho too long. I could not stand the fact that there was so many people in such a small area, everybody rushing somewhere. Now I've been in that kind of atmosphere in airports, but this was out in the street during the day. And I guess I had a little bit of a panic attack and I had to turn around and get out of there. I couldn't stay. I had wanted to go to some of the honky tonk places at night and I just couldn't take it. So I took a bus tour of the historic district and then I turned around and headed out of town again. So I hope your visit to New Orleans goes much better. Just east of there, I crossed into Mississippi and I had to take advantage of this, an airboat ride through an alligator swamp. What more fun could you possibly have on a sunny day? Continuing around, I crossed into Florida, going down the Florida coast, went through Tampa, and this was one of the points of interest that I had on my list. And I got down to Big Cat Rescue and found out that they didn't open until the afternoon. It was still early in the morning. Sun was not shining. It looked like it was going to start raining anytime. So I wanted to put some miles behind me. And this is one of the places where I rushed. Instead of taking the time to go in, I went into the gift shop and looked around and I left again. To give you an idea how much it looked like it was going to rain, I was standing in the parking lot, putting the helmet on to get ready to leave. And I heard a noise. I turned around and looked, and it was the rain coming down on the roof of the gift shop I had just come out of. And before I could even get on the bike and get it started, it moved across the parking lot. I rode a quarter of a mile down the road and jumped into a McDonald's restaurant. When I got in there, just in that quarter mile, I was soaked so bad, I literally had water running out of
What? Oh, no. Jerry?
Jerry's screen is frozen. It could be just the screen, or it could be that he's going to have to restart the session, close his Zoom and come and start a new session. He can start right there from his.
Oh, no.
At times, Zoom can put a pretty heavy load on a
Yeah.
machine. And it depends also on your internet line speed.
And I think I'll give him a call.
Yeah.
Hey, Jerry, we lost you. Um, I'm gonna, yes, just a second. Steve, what does he have to do?
He probably has to close Zoom and then reopen it and log right back in. You don't get rid of the PowerPoint, just leave it there.
Steve, it's not reconnecting.
He needs to see if his internet's actually functioning.
Is your internet functioning? Okay. Okay, that might be him.
He's coming back.
Okay. Alrighty, bye.
Just got to reshare again. I'll remade you co-host. You can.
Okay, can you hear me now, Steve?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see.
Still reshare. Yep.
Share. Okay, I don't know where I was when you lost me, but I was showing pictures. Can you hear me now, Debbie?
I can hear you.
Okay, so I will continue from here then. I don't know how much of the country you missed while I was away.
Big Cats is where you left
We're
off.
at Big Cats. Okay, well, I was just saying, if you don't know anything about Big Cat Rescue, you
No,
might
Big Cats, and then the alligators were next.
okay. At Big Cat Rescue, you might want to check out the documentary Tiger King on Netflix. Tells you a lot about them. Anyway, I continued down through Florida, went across the Everglades, out onto the Keys, and made it down to Higgs Beach. I'm pretty sure that's the name of this beach. I was really disappointed in Key West. I expected these huge white sandy beaches, and I got there and the beach was a mess. There was all kinds of junk all over it. It smelled terrible. It looked terrible. Might have been because a storm had just gone through the area. Maybe they go out and clean the beaches up and it'll be in better condition when you get there. But anyway, I did make it to Key West, Florida, which is the southernmost point in the United States. Took some pictures, visited a little bit, and then turned around and headed back to the mainland. I went up through Miami and just north of Miami along the Atlantic coast now. I went to Fort Pierce, Florida, the U.S. Navy SEAL Museum, and had a good time there. If you're into military things, this is a must-see. Gives the entire history of the SEALs from World War II through the present day. And there's a lot to see and do there. So if you're into military, that is one place you want to put on the list to make sure that you take that in. Continuing north, I stayed with the sister of a friend from here in Boise who lives on Merritt Island, which is right next to Cape Canaveral. And they took me out in the morning. We stopped to see some of the scrub jays at a sanctuary, bird sanctuary. And then we went over to Cape Canaveral. Because the people I was staying with do volunteer work on the Cape, they had what I call a backdoor pass. So we got to go in and tours and look at things that the average tourist didn't get to see. But again, if you're into outer space things, the space program in general, this is an absolute must see. They have stuff there that brought back memories from my childhood, and just fascinating when you think about the space program. The little white building in this picture was Launch Complex 26. And we got to go in there. We kind of hooked up with one of the bus tour groups that was going through there at the time. Got to see the computer that was used to monitor the first flights into outer space. They launched, I believe, Explorer 1 was the first satellite that went into outer space. If you saw the movie Hidden Figures, you know that computers were rather new when the space program was just starting out. This computer has 5 kilobytes of memory. That's all it has. And they didn't trust the computer, so the humans were still making all the adjustments to the trajectory and firing the rockets and whatnot to control the first rocket launches. The computers were just making suggestions on what they could do because of what they were reading as far as fuel and that type of thing. But the computers weren't controlling it, the humans were. This is the, I don't remember which launch complex it is, but this is the one where the Apollo 1 sat when the fire broke out that killed 3 astronauts early in the Apollo program. After that tragedy, they decommissioned this launch site, went to a different one. But this is giving you an idea how close we were able to get to some of the sites down there on the Cape. Traveling north from there, one of the things is real big for me because I have a love for all things transportation wise. I've always been a fanatic when it comes to auto racing. And if you follow auto racing, you know very well the track at Daytona. They had just gone through a $400 million renovation of the facilities. I went in, took a tour of it, took a trolley, or I guess you'd call it a trolley car, around the bottom of the track, and they stopped at the start-finish line so we could climb up the embankment. Now, this is only 18-degree embankment, but this is at the start-finish line. If you look down in the center of the picture, way back at that previous turn, that's coming off of turn 4, which is 31-degree banking. So you can imagine how fast those cars go around that corner. They hit speeds of about 200 miles an hour on this track. From there, I continued north through Florida into Georgia and ended up going to Savannah, Georgia. I had to take a tour of Savannah. My wife was involved for most of her adult life with Girl Scouts, and the Girl Scouts of the USA had their start with Juliet Lowe, who lived in Savannah. And the first meetings were held there and the organization began there. So I had to go take this tour. So when I came into town, I bought a ticket for a tour. It started at 1 o'clock. I went to lunch, came back and checked in a few minutes early. And they told us, well, there might be a problem. See, the animal activists in Savannah have been complaining to the city that it's too hot. The horses shouldn't have to work in the heat. So they made us stand in line in the sun while they hosed down the horses, gave them a sponge bath. And at 1 o'clock, they came and took a measurement with a rectal thermometer, said the horse is good to go, and we're okay as long as the heat index doesn't hit 110. Heat index is the feels like temperature that they always talk about, combination of the humidity and the temperature. It was at 109. As long as it wasn't 110, they were okay to go. So we clip, clop down through historic Savannah, got 14 blocks away, turned around to make the trip back. They called them on the radio and said, it hit 110, shut her down. So the horse got to go back to his air-conditioned barn, and all the senior citizens had to walk 14 blocks back in the midday sun to get back to where our cars were. So don't ever let it be said that Savannah doesn't take care of its horses. Continuing north from there, I made a little trip inward, away from the ocean, and went to Pinehurst, North Carolina. Again, some friends live in Pinehurst. I went and spent a night with them, and we went out and toured the Carolina Hotel the next day, and across the road is Pinehurst course number 2. And at the clubhouse, they let me go back through the clubhouse and take a picture of the famous statue of Payne Stewart that sits out behind the clubhouse. And so I got that picture. I also talked the guy into let me get on one of their golf carts. So I got another form of transportation, an iconic form of transportation, a golf cart at Pinehurst of all places. So Then I was kind of in a rush to get by the weekend to get up to Washington, D.C. I have a brother in Washington, D.C. that works long hours during the week, but he could see me and we could visit over the weekend. So I was rushing up the coast, but I had to stop. One of the 3 items I had listed at the beginning that I had to see was Big Kill Devil Hill at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The picture on the left here is from the monument looking down the hill that the first flight took place on. And the picture on the right is looking in the other direction, back up the flight line towards the hill. I don't know if you can make out the monument at the top of the hill or not. 4 flights took place on December 17th, 1903. The first one was the historic one everybody knows about. They went 120 feet in 12 seconds, was all the longer that flight was. But it was the first powered flight by man, and it opened up the age of aviation for the world. To give you an idea of how big a deal this was, 10 years later, they were using airplanes for reconnaissance missions in World War I. And some 60 years later, they had rockets in outer space. 66 years roughly later, they landed a man on another planet. And that's how fast aviation grew during the 20th century. Here's the marker. There was a similar marker for the ending of the other 3 flights that took place at Kitty Hawk that day. And it just kind of brings home how fresh and new really the aviation industry is. And I loved every minute of it. Got up to Washington, D.C. My brother and I decided to go over to Mount Vernon and take a tour over there. We had a ticket to get into the plantation home itself, but there was such a long line that we decided not to do that. We did tour the museums, and they were very, very good, very well laid out, some excellent exhibits. So if you ever make it to DC, that's one of the things that you can do there. Racing along, coming back down to the coast from DC, I stopped at Fredericksburg and took a tour, and it was a very, very good tour. I don't normally like to take the tours when I go to national parks. I like to kind of do things on my own. But in this case, the ranger that did the tour here did an excellent job of explaining the Battle of Fredericksburg during the Civil War. This battle was just a slaughter of Union troops. They had over 12,000 casualties just in one day. And they had a 600-yard field they had to cross. And in order to get across there, they had to, advance in waves. The Confederates sat behind this brick wall. It was called the Sunken Road. It's not brick, it's stone, I'm sorry. But they came across, and they made 14 attempts to get across this 600-yard field. And all day long, not one single Union soldier made it across that field. They ended up retreating time and time again. But the one story that they told about this was about Richard Kirkland, who has been labeled the Angel of Mary's Heights, which is where the battle actually took place, just outside of Fredericksburg. After the fighting had stopped, the Union Army is on one side of the field, the Confederates are on the other side of the field. This Confederate soldier could hear the wounded soldiers laying out in the middle of this field, moaning and asking for help. He gathered up canteens from some of his compatriots and walked out into this field, putting himself at harm, and gave water to many of the people that were laying in this field. So he's known now as the Angel of Mary's Heights. It was a very touching story. From there, I went just a little bit further south to Yorktown, went to take the tour of the battlefield at Yorktown. It was nothing like the tour of Fredericksburg. If you're ever in the area, make sure you go to Fredericksburg, but don't feel bad if you have to skip Yorktown. It was the stereotypical canned tour, and I did not enjoy that. There wasn't as much to see there, and the tour was certainly not as good either. From there, I went down to, I believe it's Lewis, Delaware, put the bike on the ferry to cross over to Cape May, New Jersey. And as we were getting the vehicles on, it started to sprinkle. You can see by the clouds that it wasn't looking real good. We went inside and upstairs, and we were just cast off, and the storm broke loose, and it came down in buckets. So there's a bunch of people sitting in this one room simultaneously. Everybody's cell phone goes off, and we look, and there's tornado warnings. So this storm was quite a forceful storm, but we made it across the mouth of the bay at Delaware Bay over to New Jersey. When we pulled in, you can see my yellow motorcycle down there in the bottom of the picture. I was the first one on. I had to be the first one off. So as they're pulling up, they had me go down and sit on my bike in this driving rain. And, to say I got wet would be an understatement. When we got off, there was puddles on the roads that were in some places a foot deep that I had to make my way through. The biggest problem was cars going in the other direction, splashing water on top of me. But I made it. Got up through New Jersey. I found a Harley Davidson dealer that could service my bike on short notice. Got new tires and some other work done. And while they were doing that, took about a day, I went into New York City. Finally got to see the Statue of Liberty. I got on the Staten Island ferry, went up, cruised past the statue, took my pictures. It lands at Staten Island. Everybody gets off, circles around, comes back, gets back on the boat, comes back past the Statue of Liberty, got more pictures. And as we were coming into the dock at Battery Park, I looked off to the right, and there was a heliport over there. And that was another of the things of interest that I had marked on the map, that you can take helicopter tours. Well, I hadn't made any reservations, but I walked over there, and sure enough, they were able to get me on a helicopter. So I took a tour in the air of Lower Manhattan Island. We went up the Hudson River as far as the George Washington Bridge, circled around, came back. And this was on the way back. You see the white building on the very far right lower corner of the picture. That's the ferry terminal at Battery Park. Just above that in this picture is the heliport. But the thing I noticed as we were coming back was the ship in the very lower right corner. They have tours on the, I call them the tall ships, the sailing yachts, or whatever you want to call them, the double-masted schooners. And so when I got off the helicopter, I walked over, got on a sailboat, went out past the Statue of Liberty again, got more pictures, and just had a great time. There was just enough wind. They were able to put the sails up. I got to help pull the line to put the sails up, and we sailed past the Statue of Liberty, circled around, came back past it again. So I got to see the Statue of Liberty as much as anybody has ever seen the Statue of Liberty on that day. Just had a really good time. It really made my day. Walking north from there, I went to the memorials for the World Trade Center, for the 9/11 memorials that stands in the footprint of where the World Trade Center was. That was a very somber occasion, but well worth seeing. From New York, then I went back to New Jersey, picked up my motorcycle, and then I had to ride back through New York City traffic to get over to Connecticut. Came up along the Connecticut coastline to Newport, Rhode Island, crossed over the Newport Bridge again, but this was the East Coast version of the Newport Bridge, and made it to Newport, Rhode Island, where I was stationed when I was in the Navy. So there wasn't a lot there I really needed to see because I had already seen it. Made a quick trip down the Ocean Drive and then headed out into Massachusetts. And I don't even know what town or city this picture was taken in. There's 100 seaports in Massachusetts. Every one of them looks just like this, boats everywhere. But it's very picturesque, very good place to visit. And I don't know if you're into boats or not, but I bet you can find somebody to take you out on a boat. I was going to go to Hyannisport when I was on Cape Cod. Ended up, there was a Kennedy Museum in Barnstable, very close to Hyannisport. And so I stopped there. This museum had a large Kennedy exhibit, but also it was more telling about the Kennedy family and not just RFK and JFK. So it told about Ethel and the other Kennedys, and it was well worth the time to go through that museum also. I just feel like I'm rushing so much here, but you go up along the outer edge of Cape Cod, came to the Cape Cod Lighthouse, which actually had to be moved inland 400 and some feet because the coast of Cape Cod is eroding so fast, they were afraid the lighthouse was going to fall into the ocean. In fact, when the Pilgrims came across in 1620, they first made landfall on Cape Cod. They sat there for a week or so while search parties went to the mainland to look for the best place to set up their settlement. And the actual place that the Pilgrims landed at Cape Cod is now part of the ocean. So that's how badly it's eroding. I had hoped there would be some kind of sandy beach there too. Nope, it's a swamp. I went all the way out to the end by Provincetown, and it was just a swamp. There was nothing to see or do out there. Didn't really smell real good either. But anyway, made it out to the end of Cape Cod. Next day, I turned around, came back, and got to drive in Boston rush hour traffic. That was fun, and made it back to Salem and saw these pieces of art just down the street from the Salem Witch Museum. Made another museum tour, and they told about the Salem witch trials, which were in 1692, 1693. And it was very interesting. There was 200 people during that period of time that were accused of being witches. Some 90 of them were convicted, and I believe 14 people were actually hung. There was nobody burned at the stake, as the story often goes. That wasn't in Salem, but there was 14 people, I believe 5 men and 9 women, something like that, that were actually put to death during the Salem witch trials. Continuing along the coast of New England, went up through Massachusetts, crossed briefly through New Hampshire, made it to Maine, went to Kennebunkport, Maine, and saw the Bush Museum. I was going to go there to give the Republicans equal time on my tour, but it was not open. And so once again, under threatening skies, I decided to continue along the Maine coast, made it out to Bar Harbor, where there was mist lying on the coastline. Now, when I got to Bar Harbor, and you can read more about this in my blog, when I got to Bar Harbor, I had an image in my mind from a family vacation we took when we went to Bar Harbor of this quaint little town in Maine. Unfortunately, between 1987 or whenever it was that we were there and the current day, the cruise ships have decided it's a good port of call. So now the population, when a cruise ship pulls into town, the population of Bar Harbor doubles. There is as many people on the cruise ship as there is that live in Bar Harbor. And when I got there, again, it just wasn't the same, and I couldn't take it. I don't know if it was a panic attack or what it was, but looking back on my previous experience and comparing what I saw there, I just packed up and left. I ate dinner there, had a great time, but I was really sorry to see what had happened to that small, quaint little town in my memory. Went all the way east to the Canadian border and went to Lubbock, Maine. And this was a fascinating little town. Did another tour of a museum there and heard some of the history of this town. I don't have time to go into it now, but if you have a chance, check out the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company in Lubbock, Maine. It ended up being the birth of Lubbock and also pretty much the death of Lubbock, other than other industries that opened in the area. But this was a early day kind of a Ponzi scheme, even though this was before Ponzi. But it was a couple people that got investors to invest a lot of money in this little city because they were getting gold out of the ocean. And it ended up all being a ruse. So anyway, check it out. You'll enjoy the story. All through New England are beautiful sites, beautiful old towns, and every little old town has its claim to fame and has its patriotic decorations up. At this time, it was coming up on the 4th of July weekend. There was American flags everywhere. I went through this little town. I believe it's LaGrange is the name of the place in LaGrange, Maine. And I stopped and I saw this monument and I took a picture of it because I saw there was a lot of names there from World War I. And this is just a small little town in Maine. I did some research on this. I found out the names that are listed there amounted to 10%. 1 out of every 10 people that lived in that town lost their lives in World War I. And that's how thoroughly dedicated these small towns in New England were to our early history, that they were willing to give their lives and fight in these wars. I just found that fascinating that it was such a high percentage of people from one town. Anyway, continuing on, started coming back now across northern parts of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, crossed into upstate New York, and rode for a while along the St. Lawrence Seaway. What was interesting here was I had a navigation system talking to me in speakers in my helmet, and there's 2 women that give the different directions, one in one ear, one in the other. Well, when I got along the St. Lawrence Seaway, the one was speaking English and the other was speaking French. I thought that was kind of interesting. But came back down through Erie, Pennsylvania into Cleveland. I had lived in Cleveland for 19 years, so there really wasn't anything there for me to tour and see. I did stop and take a picture of the Key Bank building. The terminal tower is in there. And across the street from where that picture was taken is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which if you're into music, it's something that you probably want to do when you're in the area. I had already been there, so I kept moving. Came across the southern edge of Lake Erie, crossed up into Michigan, went to Detroit. Detroit, of course, has a lot of history to it, but I found this interesting. I was instructed to go down East Jefferson Avenue. Well, East Jefferson Avenue starts on one end with the Joe Louis Arena, this big, huge building. This statue is a tribute to Joe Louis, the heavyweight boxing champion. All around this intersection were large corporate office buildings for the auto manufacturers and whatnot. You go just a little ways down the street and it changes. There was, first of all, there was a Bob's Big Boy restaurant, had to stop and have lunch there. And just beyond the Big Boy restaurant was some typical inner city neighborhoods. Windows broken, bars on the windows, the blacktop was all broken up. It was just in a shambles. And it was really sad to see what had happened to this neighborhood so close to the corporate offices. And then you continue just down the road and almost with a snap of the fingers, you cross into Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which is the highest per capita income area of any city in Michigan. And you have gated communities, all the trees, and it was just beautiful. All of this within an 8-mile section along East Jefferson Road in Detroit. So it was a real cultural juxtaposition, and it really catches your attention when you go through there. But staying on the road, we continued up along the east coast of Michigan, got up to Mackinac, and we crossed into the Upper Peninsula, or the UP as the locals call it. And I should say, well, my wife was with me, but I crossed into the UP, took in the town of Detour, Michigan, which is the easternmost point of Upper Michigan, and then went along the north edge of the Upper Peninsula, went through Sault Ste. Marie, took a tour of the the straits there. And saw that, stopped and ate there. And then I continued just west of there over to Whitefish Bay and went to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, which I found quite fascinating. They talked about many of the shipwrecks that have taken place in Lake Superior going back through the years, some back into the 1800s. But of course, the one thing that was featured most prominently was the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which I say they featured it prominently. They played Gordon Lightfoot's song over and over and over and over and over again all the time you were in the museum, to the point where you just couldn't wait to get out of the museum because you'd heard the song so many times. But it was very interesting. They had very good displays. This was the bell that they were able to raise from the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And it was quite picturesque also, looking out across the huge, huge Lake Superior. Continued along the north coast to Pictured Rock near Munsing, Michigan. And at that point, I took off on another side trip. I headed almost due south all the way down to the Wisconsin-Illinois border to my hometown of Beloit, Wisconsin. Spent a couple of weeks with my 90-year-old mother, and then turned around and drove back up through Wisconsin again. Got back up to the perimeter route that I had laid out and went to Ashland, Wisconsin. Now, Ashland, Wisconsin was pointed out to me that I wanted to go there. And the reason for that was all the murals. They have a large section of the downtown that has murals on their buildings. Now, there are a lot of murals in a lot of towns all across this nation, but this, I think, may have been the first time I ever saw a mural of buildings painted on buildings. And so that was, I thought, rather unique, the way they did that. Of course, there was a lot of other murals also, but it was interesting to ride through Ashland and see that. Also went over to Duluth Superior area, and in Superior, they have a veterans, it's not really a museum, but it's a display of a lot of World War II memorabilia. This was the home of Richard Bong, Major Richard Bong, who was considered the ace of aces. He had more kills in World War II than any of the other American pilots. He had 40 kills during World War II. This was his plane. I believe it was a P48L plane that he flew. And this, when the Japanese Air Force saw these planes, they knew they were in trouble, because this was one that was easily outmaneuvered their planes. And so Richard Bong had this museum there. They told a little bit of his life story. Ironically, he was the ace of aces, like I said, but he died in August of 1945 on the same day the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He died in a plane crash while testing a jet fighter that they were developing. And so it was rather ironic that him, of all people, was flying this plane that died on that day of all days. So continuing along, went to Ely, Minnesota. And in Ely, I took a tour of the International Wolf Center. Of course, wolves are kind of controversial here in Idaho and some other areas, but they are simply presenting the history of the wolf in North America. They said they don't get involved in any controversy. They don't want to talk about it. But anyway, just down the street from the Wolf Center is the North American Bear Center. And this actually, unlike the Wolf Center, they actually take in injured bears and nurse them back to health so they can be re-released into the wild. They had several bears in there at the time. Got a picture of one down in the corner of the screen. So interesting day. Continued from there. I went up to International Falls, Minnesota. You probably heard them mentioned once or twice on the weather reports in the winter. This quite often is the coldest spot in the United States, several times during each winter. And this is the Rainy River that flows through International Falls. And the one thing that, hold on, I'm gonna silence my phone. The one thing that I found interesting about this was the river was flowing to the west and not to the east. And for some reason, I had always figured that the river at International Falls flowed over into the Mississippi River. Come to find out, I'm not the only one that's ever been confused by that. Made it a little bit further west to the town of War Road, Minnesota. And in War Road, Minnesota, you're on the edge of Lake of the Woods, which is on the border between Minnesota and Canada. What happened was at the end of the Revolutionary War, Ben Franklin was sent to Paris to meet with British authorities to draw up the terms of surrender for the British and to draw up the border of the new country that was formed, the United States. When he went, he took with him a map that had been made by a trapper in this area, and they showed Lake of the Woods, and they showed it as draining into the Mississippi. So when the border was described in this treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, they described a line drawn from this lake down and then over to the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, they said it went south and west to the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River is to the east. So the way it was laid out, there was no official border. I mean, it was not possible to draw this line that they were describing. So what they did in 1815 or thereabouts, they sat down with Canada and made another treaty and further described the border. They drew a line from the far northwest corner of Lake of the Woods south to the 49th parallel and then west from there. So the 49th parallel is that long line that goes across between Canada and the United States. And when this line was drawn south to that point, it cut off a portion of the land on the northwest edge of this lake. This land has become known as the Northwest Angle, and it is the northernmost point of the contiguous 48 states. It's not connected to Minnesota. You have to go through Canada to get there, unless you go across the lake. But anyway, it's known as the Northwest Angle, and this is, I'm kind of a history buff, and this is one of the things that really gets my juices flowing. So I love the story of this. If you're interested in it, look up the Northwest Angle. You will find very few people that know that the northernmost point of the lower 48 is in Minnesota, not Maine, and it's the Northwest Angle. Continuing on my way, I went across Minnesota, crossed into North Dakota. About halfway across North Dakota, I came to the International Peace Gardens. This garden was established back before World War II to commemorate the longest unguarded border in the world between Canada and the United States. The monument on the right was built in the 1980s, and it sits on the 49th parallel. And unfortunately, something didn't work out right because the cement that they used was falling apart. When I was there, they had already had pieces of this monument fall out, and they put a fence around the bottom. You can probably see in the picture there to keep people away because it was no longer considered safe. It was scheduled for demolition. So when I was there, about a month before I arrived, they had actually dedicated another memorial to the longest unguarded border in the world. Unfortunately, or ironically, the longest unguarded border in the world is no longer long and unguarded. It is guarded. When you come out of the Peace Garden, regardless if you turn left and go to Canada or turn right and go to the United States, you end up going through customs. So the story has lost some of its luster, but it's still a nice place to visit. They've got a lot of beautiful gardens there. If you're ever in North Dakota, hey, knock yourself out. It's a good place to go. Coming back down a little bit south of the border, I crossed down into Minot, North Dakota. And in Minot, they have the Northern Dakota Territory Air Museum. They have 3 hangars full of planes there. And it, again, if you're into aviation or military, it is fascinating. They have some of the more modern jets outside on the lawn, if you will, outside the hangars. And inside they have just unbelievable number of aircraft. They're hanging from the ceiling. They're tucked in every corner, all the way back to a 1910 Curtiss Pusher. You probably think like I did, this looks a lot like the Wright brothers plane. Well, this was about the same era. Curtiss was one of the biggest competitors to Wright brothers when they started building airplanes. But they have all these different examples of different types of planes in there. Some of them from World War II, like the Fighting Tigers, a lot of bombers, fighters, not just from this country, but from other countries also. And it was very well laid out. Like I said, if you're into aviation, if you're into military, this is a must see. This is, and I've been to the Warhawk Museum here in Nampa, Idaho, but this is perhaps even better than the Warhawk Museum, or at least on that same level. So check it out if you're ever in Minot. I actually had to backtrack just a little bit here. I had forgotten one of the things I wanted to see was the geographical center of North America, which is in Rugby, North Dakota. So I traveled about 60 miles back from Minot to take in the picture of this monument. And I turned right around and traveled 60 miles back again. So that was a case where I did slow down to enjoy the view and didn't decide that I needed to be moving ahead. So continued across North Dakota, crossed into Montana, and I came to the town of Havre, Montana. And there, I took a tour of underground Havre. In 1904, they had this small town, and there was a fire. It was actually a fire that was set by a couple drunks. They got hauled into jail for disturbing the peace. When they got out the next morning, they were sober enough to get out of jail, but they weren't sober enough to know what they were doing. They went over and they started a fire behind one of the buildings, and it spread through downtown. Wasn't on the scale of the Chicago fire, but it did wipe out 4 city blocks of this town, all these old wooden buildings. The town fathers would not let them rebuild in wood. They had to use stone, but there wasn't enough stone to rebuild the city. So what the merchants did was they dug down into the bedrock and actually built the city again underneath the ground. And to get lighting down there, they put glass, pieces of colored glass in the sidewalk so that the sunlight could come down into the underground section of downtown Havre. And they had everything you could think of down there. They had drugstore, barbershop, tanning facilities, or tanning like in tanning hides, not suntan beds. But they had everything you could possibly think of. And some of the merchants got together and actually advertised on this tabletop that was rescued from one of the underground buildings. I don't know if you can see it or not, but some of the places had their phone numbers listed on this. And if you go around this table and look, you'll see that some of these phone numbers are 2- and 3-digit phone numbers. And that'll give you an idea of how old this underground town was. But it was a fascinating trip. Had a good time touring it. The tour guide did a good job of explaining the history of the town. So from Havre, I continued west, made it over to East Glacier in East Glacier, Montana. Now, I had said that I wanted to tell a little bit of the story here. What happened was my wife and I, when we got married back in 1975, we took off in an RV and toured around the Western states. Kind of like this trip, we had picked out ahead of time that we want to go to this place, and this place. One of the places on the list was Glacier National Park. The books that we were looking through had some beautiful pictures of going to the Sun Road, which goes up and over Glacier National Park. And so when we got there, it was the 1st of October, we pulled into East Glacier and wanted to go and drive up through the park. Well, going to the Sun Road was closed for the season already because of snowfall. Now, if you're not familiar with Glacier National Park, let me tell you, going to the Sun Road up at the top is Logan Pass. It's 6,600 feet elevation. It's right up next to the Canadian border, so it's quite a ways north. They average 80 feet of snow every winter, 80 feet. And so it's closed usually from September until after the 4th of July weekend. They go in July and start clearing the road, and it is such slow going that sometimes they can only get 500 feet of road opened up because of the per day opened up because of the amount of snow that's on this road that they have to clear away. So we were unable to go to Glacier National Park. For 39 years, I was married to this wonderful woman, and we promised each other that one of these days we will get back to Glacier, and we never did. So to fulfill that promise I had made to my wife, this was the final point that I absolutely had to go to on this trip. I had to take my wife in spirit on a tour of Glacier National Park. So when I got to East Glacier, I went to the lodge, which is just on the other side of that entryway that you were seeing there. And a beautiful, beautiful lodge. It's about 100 years old, and it's just a gorgeous place. I went up to the counter and I was trying to find out what there is to see, how you go about seeing most of Glacier National Park. I walked up to the lady at the counter and I asked her if there was a possibility. I saw they had red bus tours were the best way to see the park. I asked if there was a vacant seat on a red bus tour, and she looked at me with disbelief. She said, "We are in the middle of our high season. It's a holiday weekend, or not a holiday weekend, but a weekend in a warm weather tourist business. There's no way." But she said, "I'll check the computer." She goes into the computer and she comes back with this strange look on her face. She said, "There is one spot available on this tour bus. I don't believe it. There's one spot available. And if you want it, how many people are in your party?" And I started to explain to her that there was only one of me, but I was taking my wife, and started explaining about the history of how long, for 40 years, we have been planning this trip. And by the time I got done, I was in tears. She was in tears. But I got a seat on a red bus tour of Glacier National Park. So the next morning we took off. We crossed the second lowest point on the Continental Divide and went over to West Glacier National Park. And then the tour comes back across the park to the east side again. And as you enter the park on the west side, you first come to McDonald Lake, and you get a first view of how beautiful these mountains are going to be. And it is a gorgeous, gorgeous park. You travel up along the edge of McDonald Lake. Eventually you end up traveling along the edge of Avalanche Creek. And there's a couple places along the way where you get out and can take pictures. Beautiful, beautiful thing. Then you get on going to the Sun Road. Well, this road was an engineering marvel in its day. I believe it was put in back in the 1930s. They went 50 miles across this mountain. And now, if you've never driven on a mountain road, this might not seem like much to you, but in this 50 miles, they only had one switchback to climb up and over these mountains. So it was a fascinating engineering feat. This road is narrow in places. It's quite steep. For the most part, all you have that keeps you on the road is this little 1 or 2 foot tall stone wall along the edge. And had I gone there with my wife, she would have been terrified because she did not like roads like this. I loved it. I took a picture at this particular point in the road because you see the 3 arches there. This 3 arch bridge was apparently something that was incredibly difficult to do. They actually took engineers from Italy to come over and build this 3 arch bridge in native stone so they could continue this highway up the side of the mountain. You get up to the top or close to the top, you see maybe on the mountainside on the right, that's called the Garden Wall, and the road comes up across the face of that. Logan Creek going down through the middle of the valley there. Very, very picturesque. Go up even a little bit higher. This is Mount Oberlin. And you see the rounded valley down below you. That is because these valleys were all formed by glaciers. And so they're rounded. If it's pointed on the bottom, apparently that is an indication that it's erosion, but the rounded valleys are more a matter of glacier movement. So you go just around the corner from Mount Oberlin and you get up to Logan Pass. Now, we had been on this tour bus with a open top. It has a canvas top on it that you can roll back so you can see above you. You see the mountain peaks as you go by. And we have been on this for half a day at this point, and have been talking back and forth there was 17 people in this bus, and the people in the seats near me, we were talking, and I had explained to them about taking this tour and taking my wife on this tour in spirit. And we become friends, and they had heard the story of how I had traveled around the country, very rarely getting rained on, and that my wife was moving the clouds to the side. And all along the way, the clouds were setting in, but they were staying behind us. So we got up to the top and they said, should we put the top up on the car? Because it looks like we're going to get rain on. This was the tour guide asking us. And everybody on the bus said, no, Betty won't let us get rained on. So it was kind of a cool tribute to my wife and her ability to move clouds. But we made it all the way back down the east side of the park. In fact, we went past Gunsight Creek, flowing out of Gunsight Lake up on the side of the mountain there, and several other sites along the way. Made it down to Wild Goose Island out in the middle of St. Mary's Lake, and we had not gotten rained on. In fact, you can see in this picture was actually taken a different day. It was taken the following day, but this was one of the final scenes before we exited the park. We pulled out onto the highway, and they said, okay, let's put the top up now. We have to be at a little bit higher speeds going back to East Glaciers. And we put the roof up, got out on the road. And no sooner got on the road and it started to rain. So it was quite a celebration for us. Anyway, had a great time, such a great time that the next day I got up in East Glacier and I took my bike, and continuing west, I went east to west, back over going to the Sun Road. Because it was early in the morning, it was very dramatic with some of the mist rising up out of the valleys and up along the lakes, the rivers, up to the mountain peaks, and got some pretty good pictures going to the Sun Road on the return trip. So came out of West Glacier at that time, and went through Kalispell, crossed up over the Panhandle, northern section of northern Idaho, and crossed into the state of Washington, following Highway 2 and eventually getting onto Highway 20, which took me a little bit further north up into the North Cascade Mountains. I've lived in Idaho for almost 30 years now, and nobody had ever told me how beautiful the North Cascade Mountains were in Washington. And when I came through here, I was just delighted to see these mountain peaks coming up on each side of this highway. It was just an absolute joy to ride up through this area. And so when we got up there, this was taken on on Highway 20 as it went up over, I believe it's Rainy Pass. This is the point where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses Highway 20 in the middle of the North Cascade Mountains. So just unbelievable scenery. Every direction you looked, the scenery was just beautiful, beautiful mountain peaks. And the clouds, although they weren't cloud-free skies, the clouds that were there never gave me any problem. Went up and over the pass, came down the other side, and this is coming down into Diablo Canyon. And this was a long downhill stretch, and coasted a good bit of it coming down, and got down to the bottom and stopped and took this picture. The color of the water here is so unique because it is all glacier fed down in this canyon. And because it's glacier fed, they get a lot of minerals in the water, and the minerals are what give it this incredible picture. From the North Cascade Mountains, when you come out of the mountains, you're pretty well west across the state of Washington. And one thing I decided to do when I got all the way out towards Seattle, I wanted to cross into Canada and go up to Vancouver, British Columbia. I had never been there before. I'd seen pictures of it when the Olympics were up there. I thought, oh, it's beautiful. I've got to go there. So I crossed over the Canadian border and went up to Vancouver, found a hotel for the night, checked in, and then I took off on my bike for some sightseeing before it got dark, and went. I was going to go up to Whistler, but I was a little bit too late in the day to make it that far up. But about halfway between Vancouver and Whistler Mountain, you come to a place called the Sea to Sky Gondola. And I stopped to take a ride on the gondola up to the top of the mountain. On the way up, you see Mount Garibaldi. And when you get up to the top, there's a gift shop and a restaurant up at the top. And you get quite the view up there. If you're into hiking, you can go across this suspension bridge, and there are hiking trails on the other side. Or you can just go across the bridge and get a little bit different view of the area. They're also surrounding this place that you get off of the gondola is a open air balcony where you can stand, look through the glass sidings at the sites below. And it's just beautiful. You got all this greenish blue water in the bay down below that empties eventually back down into the Pacific Ocean. And it's quite picturesque. So you can really have a good time and see some beautiful scenery when you're up there. So I turned around, went back into Vancouver and spent the night there. The next morning, I got up and rode through downtown Vancouver. There was a bit of traffic. It wasn't, real wide open. I had difficulty, however, getting a picture of anything in downtown Vancouver because of the fact I was on a motorcycle. I couldn't just stick my head out the window and take a picture. It's much more involved when you're riding a bike. You have to get it in neutral. You have to be off to the side. You have to take the gloves off, take the helmet off, get the camera out, and do all of this stuff, and then put everything back on and then take off again. So I was kind of flowing with the traffic as I went through Vancouver. I wanted to get down to the piers because my plan was to get on a boat, cross from Vancouver over to Vancouver Island, which is out on the edge of the ocean. And from Vancouver Island, then I could catch another ferry over to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And I had to do this early enough in the day because there was only a certain number of ferries that crossed. And I had to look at the schedules of the ones going the first part of the route, make sure I could get over to where the second part of the route boarded in time to catch the last ferry of the day. So it ended up being an all-day adventure. By the time I got to the Olympic Peninsula, I rode to the northwest along the edge of the peninsula up to a place called Clallam Bay. I found one of the very few motels in the park area, and got a room for the night and managed to get some good pictures as the sun was going down, and just had a real good time. It was a nice day, but it was a long day because of all the waiting for the ferry crossings. The next morning I got up and I rode out to the very point of the Olympic Peninsula to a place called Nia Bay. Now, Nia Bay is a small town on the Indian reservation at the far western end of Olympic Park. When you're on the reservation, you can buy a pass to tour around on the reservation, and part of that tour, if you want, takes you to a trailhead where you can hike out to this point, Cape Flattery. And when you get out there, you just, it's about maybe half a mile hike to get out to Cape Flattery. And no matter which direction you look, it is beautiful. As soon as I saw this, it jumped to the top 5 on my list of favorite places that I had seen on this trip. And so I took this picture looking in one direction, you turn around the other direction, there's this little cove there with the waves coming in. And it was just beautiful. There was also, I didn't include the picture, but if you look straight out from this point, there's an island out there with I believe it's a Coast Guard station on it. And it's actually one of the furthest points that the Postal Service delivers mail to. But it also is the westernmost point accessible by road in the lower 48 states. So now I had been to Key West, the southernmost point, Lubbock, Maine, easternmost point, the northwest angle, the northernmost point, and this completed the set at the westernmost point of the lower 48 states. From there, I turned around. There are very, very few roads going through Olympic Park. So for the most part, I was still along the northern edge of the park before I could finally cut down and head back towards Astoria. And I started before I was in Astoria trying to find a motel because I didn't want to get a motel in Astoria. It's a tourist town and it was going to be really expensive. And I'm Irish, so I'm cheap. What can I say? There was no hotel rooms available anywhere. I made it all the way into Astoria, still could not find a hotel. I continued, this is back on Highway 101, like I started out now, continuing south along the coast. I could not find a hotel for the next 75 miles. I ended up riding 390 miles that day, could not find a hotel anywhere. And I ended up 9 o'clock at night sitting in a hotel, or I'm sorry, sitting in a Denny's restaurant wondering why I couldn't find a hotel. And I talked to the waitress. I said, here's my problem. I don't feel safe riding along the coast at night with the fog and the winding road and the darkness. I just didn't feel safe. I couldn't find a campground. I couldn't find a hotel anywhere. Turned out they had a regatta in Astoria that weekend. It's their busiest weekend of the year. And so she said, well, she would ask her manager, see what she could find out. Well, in the process of telling this to her, the guy in the table across the aisle from me heard this. And he said, hey, if you want, you can come pitch a tent in my brother's yard. That's what I'm doing. And I said, oh, really? So he said, yeah, I'm staying at my brother's house. I got a tent out in the yard. He won't mind. You can come stay with me. So, okay, great. So I paid for his meal to thank him for that. And he said, before we go there, though, I need to make a couple stops along the way. Well, his couple stops, one was at a bar. The other one was to pick up a birthday present for his brother. But we stopped at this bar and we went in, and I don't drink, so I'm very seldom in bars. And this is in Oregon. So I no sooner set my stuff down on a table, and he said, I'll be back. He went to look for the birthday present. And this gal comes over and she said, "Do you party?" And I said, well, once in a while, but probably not the way you're talking about. She said, "Well, do you smoke?" And she used air quotes to define smoke. I said, "No, I don't smoke." And so when the guy I was with came back, the two of them, the girl and the guy I was with, they disappeared out the back door for quite a while. So I ended up sitting in this bar playing pool with somebody I didn't know while this guy was out back, probably smoking a joint. I don't know what else they were doing out there. But he came back, he bought a shot of whiskey, had a couple shots of whiskey actually. And so then eventually, after all of this, and I'm making this story short, but I've had it written out in much more detail in my blog. We got done with this and he said, "Okay, let's go with my brother." So now I'm on my motorcycle. It's still dark. It's still foggy. It's still a winding road, but I'm trying to follow a set of taillights that are going about 90 miles an hour down this highway so I don't lose the guy on the way to his brother's house. And make a long story just slightly shorter, it was a wild, wild night. We finally got to this guy's brother's house. It was 11 o'clock at night, pitched a tent in the dark, and he decided to sit down and play his guitar for a while before we went to bed. So we were up quite late that night. Ended up being a really crazy situation, but I survived it. So don't know what else I can say about that. Next morning, I got up, continued down the coast again. I forgot I had this slide in here. This was another form of transportation. This is in this guy's backyard. He had a bicycle. I said, okay. So I took about a 6-foot tour on his bicycle so I could count it as another form of transportation. Then I headed down the coast. Eventually, after another day of riding, I made it back down to Newport, Oregon. And this was the intersection where it all began. I came in on Highway 20 from Boise. And when I got here, I turned south on 101. And at this time, I was coming back on 101 and came back to this intersection. So I stopped and took a picture. This was the completion of my P48 route. My mileage, there's no extra digit on the end there, but my mileage for the trip ended up being 16,754 miles. And actually, that was about what I had figured it was going to be. I had laid it out thinking it was going to be somewhere between 15 and 17,000 miles. And that's what it was. So I made it all the way around the country, and I did that in less than 2 hours. So I'm proud of myself. We made good time. Should have stopped and enjoyed the tour a little bit more at certain places. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer those. And okay, I don't know that there's any.
Jerry, it doesn't look like there's any questions, but I do want you to read all the kudos in the chat box.
Okay, all right, I will do that. If there's anybody still there, I had a couple of slides left here then, in case nobody had any questions. Some funny little things I saw along the way. This guy was in northern Wisconsin. He was out alongside the road fishing. And this I saw in California. I just, something struck me as funny about this sign, 24-minute parking. They sit there with a stopwatch, and it didn't make sense to me, but I thought that was funny. They share the road to a new level in California. They share the parking spaces too. I came back after eating dinner and 2 people had encroached on my space. This was down in Key West, Florida. I'd rather be here just drinking a beer than freezing my ass off up north. So, and then this is why they have HOAs. This was a guy in New Jersey that just in the middle of nowhere alongside the road, he has this big long wall and he's got all these things piled up on his wall. I bet his neighbors just love him. And this was some beach rules. I kind of give you a little bit of the attitude of the beach people. And then this was my favorite restaurant. This was in New Jersey also. You detect a bit of a attitude here with the name of this restaurant. So, and oh, I see I got cut off here. This was a saying that I carried with me, kind of a philosophy for the road, that you will never carry anything in your life heavier than regret. And just make sure that on your journey through life that you don't carry too heavy a load. So my wife and I didn't make it to all the places we had wanted to. And hopefully you'll get out and tour and make it to the places you want before it's too late. So that's all I have for today. And I appreciate everybody that checked in with us.
Jerry, you did an excellent, superb, terrific job. And I think that everyone really enjoyed it. You need to read the chat box, please.
I will do that. I will do that. So thank you, everybody. And I will let you go now.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, thank you.